I'm Morena Winstanley. I'm the Director of Research Partnerships at Smart Prosperity Institute. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Smart Prosperity Institute, we're based at the Institute of the Environment, which is down at the end of campus there, and part of the Faculty of Social Sciences. We work on a range of issues from sustainable finance to circular economy, land use, and agriculture. Before we dive into things, I wanted to share the University of Ottawa's Indigenous affirmation as a statement of welcome and honor to the ancestors and people living who've lived in this space and cared for it, and to acknowledge the ongoing relationship of people to their homeland. If you feel comfortable doing so, I welcome you to join me in reading out the Indigenous affirmation, as it's meant to be a group expression. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge their traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Thank you. That was lovely. Today, you will hear from a few of the projects funded through the EEPRN, the Economics and Environment Policy Research Network. Since 2012, the EEPRN has funded academic policy research on a myriad of environmental issues, and also funded the work of over 100 students. In doing so, we have worked closely with our funders, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and the success of the EEPRN is theirs as much as ours. With that in mind, I would like to invite Anne Kovic to give opening remarks on behalf of ECC.
All right. I haven't spoken at a microphone in some time, so this works. Hello, so my name is Anne Kavlovic. I'm the Director of the Economic Research Unit at Environment and Climate Change Canada. So just a few quick words about my department's involvement with the EEPRN. It's one part of our academic engagement strategy in the world of economics. The funding agreement began in 2011. And we rely on the Smart Prosperity Institute to sort of administer the funds that go to the network across Canada. The normal schedule of annual symposiums and call for proposals was a bit disrupted by COVID and a few other factors, but things are getting back on track. When projects come back in response to calls for proposals, Environment and Climate Change Canada, we offer our opinion based on topics and what we think is most policy relevant, but we rely on Smart Prosperity Institute to facilitate an open and transparent process, both to ensure the academic rigor and transparency of the process of projects that are selected. And why do we do this? The goal is to support a stronger and a faster alignment between environmental policy that's happening live and academic research that could inform it. And that nut seems like it should be easier to crack than it sometimes is. This network can be very useful, and I think especially in the early days too, for building capacity. I remember when I started as an environmental economist, a few years ago now, I would regularly be asked if that was an oxymoron, and that's less the case now. The field has developed a lot in the past 10 years, in Canada in particular. But it remains key to sort of build connections that stimulate innovative but really policy-relevant research, stuff that the people who are actually making the decisions or informing people who are making the decisions can use to make those decisions smarter. So why does all this matter? We need fresh ideas, particularly in the decarbonization space. We've kind of tried everything. You can have a conversation about stringency and implementation, but the known tools have been used. And then more so in the triple planetary crisis and biodiversity, we need fresh ideas. But we also need boring ideas. And what I mean by that is decision support tools or just distillations of the literature, understanding really what the body of evidence has to say. is very important to us. And I know that doesn't necessarily always maybe give academic glory, but it can be what actually makes a decision much more well-informed in a way that makes a material difference. And part of that is also what's really important there is the interdisciplinary focus. And what the network can enable is that crossing of disciplines. I will not get into carbon pricing in any great detail today, but I think it is fair and safe for me to say I do really wonder how the world might have been different had it been just easier for banks to code the carbon rebate in a way that people could understand was actually going into their bank accounts. I do wonder in a parallel universe how things would be different from just that change. And that's not really environmental economics, sort of to do with information, but it is behavioral, it is communications, it is the adjacent disciplines that are important for implementing that decision. And part of that diversity of disciplines is also diversities of viewpoints and communities and experiences. And so I am keen to hear today from the experience of researchers who've been working with and for First Nations communities. As an environmental economist, I have a fascination with the potlatch from what I've read and from this side of the country in terms of that being such an elegant solution to how resources, it's the incentive structures around how common resources are used. So that's something I'm quite personally fascinated with. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, and thank you very much.
All right. Well, today is about two things, taking responsibility and learning. It is our task as non-Indigenous folks to self-educate and commit to responsible research practices, to take responsibility for our actions, to ensure that it underpins meaningful and collaborative partnerships with First Nations communities, governments, and thus contributes to reconciliation. So in the spirit of co-learning today, you will hear from 3 academic researchers who will share the lessons they've learned with you. I encourage you to listen with an open mind and a willingness to learn and improve. This is not easy. And so again, I want to thank you all for being here, both in person and online. Thank you for showing up for a better future. And now, I have the great pleasure to introduce our speakers and discussants. For those of you in the room, please come on up and join me on stage. I'll start with Michaela. Michaela Sadowski is a PhD candidate in Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan, where she is working under the supervision of Dr. Maureen Reed and Dr. Sherry Andrews-Key. Dr. Diane Laure Argelis is an assistant professor at Ivey Business School, Western University. Unfortunately, our third speaker, Sarah Ozog, couldn't join us today, but in her stead, Associate Professor Clifford Atleo will be presenting the work that they are doing together. Following the project presentations, we will hear from 2 discussants who will provide their reflections. Sean Brennan of Telyada Energy, a partnership of Skidegate Band Council and Old Masset Village Council in Haida Gwaii, and Nicola Drouin, who is a manager of innovative biodiversity partnerships at Canada Wildlife Service. Following the presentations, we'll open the floor up to Q&A, so please get your questions ready. We will alternate between 1 question from the floor and 1 from online. Folks online, please hit your upvote buttons. After the Q&A, we'll have a short coffee break and then head into small group discussions, which is back at the roundtables. All right, over to you, Michaela.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. My name is Michaela Sadlowski. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Saskatchewan, located in Saskatoon, which is on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. And thank you to Marina for letting us join in on a land acknowledgement for the lands that we're currently on. I also want to start by acknowledging the lands that were really crucial in supporting this research. So the community that I partnered with on the project that I'll talk about today is Sache Ndene. in English, Doig River First Nation, and they are located on Treaty 8 territory in what is now known as northeastern British Columbia. The openness and the willingness to share their knowledge with me was the thing that allowed this research to happen. So I just want to express gratitude for this land and its people. So Doig River is intimately familiar with the impact of climate change. Since 2022, when we initiated our work together, the community has experienced unprecedented flooding, erosion, and wildfire. And in fact, they've been required to evacuate because of wildfire twice in the past 2 years, and this has never happened in their memory. So suffice to say, this community is intimately familiar with what climate change feels like. Research has shown us also that the impacts of climate change are different depending on our social identity and social location. So things like our gender, age, socioeconomic status, culture, and the many other things that make us who we are affect how we experience and understand climate change. So very briefly, what we set out to do in this research project was to figure out a way to plan for the impacts of climate change that considers the social realities and the social dimensions of the community and represents the diversity of voices, perspectives, and experiences that are located there. But for our purposes today, I'm going to focus a little bit more on how we went about this rather than what our findings were. So I'm going to ask you to come with me as we shift from focusing on outcome to focusing more on process. This is really relevant for our conversation, but also due to the approach that we took to the research, which was a transdisciplinary research approach. What this really means is that the research was co-designed and co-produced along with community knowledge holders, community members and staff, from the project design through to selecting methods, collecting and analyzing data, and then deciding on what outputs should look like. I am going to talk about a few principles that I've distilled from my experience in this work. They all happen to start with L, so I'm calling them the L principles. And I'd just like to keep in mind that these might not be brand new to you, or they might feel a little bit obvious, and I think that's okay. I am going to get into a little bit of how these showed up specifically in the work that we did together. So first, lean into reflexivity, learn to listen and listen to learn, let the community lead, and I've added arrows to indicate a few things. One, to remind us that these aren't things that we just do and then move on from, but they are practices and they are processes, and I'm going to talk a lot about process as opposed to outcomes, so you might hear that word a lot. I've also connected them to show that they inform and build upon each other, and that I think they need to happen kind of all together. They're mutually reinforcing. So reflexivity, what is it? It is a process of critical reflection. It allows us to understand who we are and what we bring to the work that we do, including the biases and assumptions that are inherent in our worldviews. It is a process that is really personal, and I think that it needs to be, but it's also a process that can and should be done collectively with other people, especially in this transdisciplinary research context. So what might that look like? In our case, we built kind of intentional moments of critical reflection or reflexivity into our methods. For example, in our interview questions, we asked participants to kind of step into the shoes of others, to think about how people in the community who are different from them might experience climate impacts differently and might have different needs and priorities, and to kind of think and reflect on that. A big part of our research was driven by a core team of community members and staff that we assembled at the outset of the project, and they guided kind of our decision making. They looked at the data that we pulled from our various methods, and we worked through it together, and we used that to inform adaptation priorities for the community. At the outset of this project, we worked together to answer the question, who makes up our community? And the way that we did this was pretty simple. We used an interactive online tool to make a word cloud. The three most commonly identified groups in that word cloud were elders, land users, and youth, but there were over 100 responses. And then we referred back to that word cloud at every future decision point where the core team was involved in collective decision making to consider things like how are different groups in the community affected differently by climate impacts, how might we more equitably distribute the costs and benefits of various adaptation measures, and those types of things were kind of incorporated into that decision making process. Learning to listen and listening to learn. As a student, I am really used to being in certain contexts where I think I'm good at learning. So in a classroom, I know what this looks like. I think I know what listening looks like. But these skills aren't necessarily directly translatable to community work, especially when it's intercultural community work and transdisciplinary community work. And the reason for that is that as a non-Indigenous person, I'm given this really unique opportunity to learn from people whose worldviews might be really fundamentally different from mine in important ways. So this required a different type of learning, a different type of listening, and it required drawing on that reflexivity that I talked about on the previous slide. The first thing I needed to learn to do was stop talking and be present. This was really important. Always leading with curiosity, leading with humility, learning to get good at saying, I don't know, or would you be willing to tell me more about that? There's this question that I like to ask myself and remind myself about throughout the research, which was, who knows most about a community? And the answer to that question is always the people who make up that community. And as an outsider and as a non-Indigenous person in an Indigenous space, the answer to that question was never me. So these things kind of helped me to get better at learning and listening in this context. And one thing that really contributed to this was the time invested up front into relationship building. For the first several weeks in the community, we didn't undertake any formal data co-production methods. I certainly did discuss my project with people. I introduced myself to people. We talked about the research, but most of this time was spent hanging out, getting to know members, attending community meetings and events, and being in spaces where it was my role to observe and listen and learn. Okay, letting the community lead. This one, it's really important in all transdisciplinary work. I think, like the others, is a little more difficult than it might sound like it is up front, and it really does require drawing back on those practices of reflexivity, listening, and learning. I think what helped in this context was having a plan to use at a starting point, but then asking questions continuously throughout about how can we tweak this, how can we adjust this, what can we do to make this better fit the priorities and perspectives that exist in this community. This also required me to learn to be flexible in my roles. So being trained as a student and as a researcher, I'm really used to being in situations where I'm asked to demonstrate my knowledge, to answer questions, to prove things. And what I needed to learn in this context was how to be more of a facilitator. Often, how to ask questions, how to understand diverse perspectives that differed sometimes really starkly from my own. Sometimes it was my job to offer solutions, and often it was my job to reflect back the things that I had heard and put them on the table for verification, but also for correction, so that I could make sure that what I thought I was learning was what the community wanted me to hear. So kind of the big example of this process was a reframing of the fundamental problem that we were trying to address in the research. The starting point that we used to conduct the adaptation planning process was drawn from climate adaptation literature, so it was framed from a Western empirical perspective. And it kind of framed our question around something that sounded like human-caused climate change is happening. How can we adapt? What we found out was that, of course, there were many ways of understanding and thinking about climate change in the community, and a lot of them weren't directly aligned with a Western framing. Again, that might seem really obvious, and the adjustment that we made might not seem that major, but it was really important to keeping diverse perspectives included in the process and keeping voices present in the room that otherwise may not have felt like it was a space for them. So we reframed our question to something that sounded more like the community has observed changes in the land and weather. How can we keep the community safe and healthy as these changes continue? So just a few examples. The three key things that I'd like us to remember are in my L that I made, and it's not a nice looking L. But I'd also like to just kind of reinforce the idea that I think as a starting point, reframing how we think about research in intercultural and transdisciplinary contexts from being outcome-oriented to being process-oriented is a really helpful and important place to start. So I hope that these principles help you to approach this type of intercultural or transdisciplinary research from the right angle. Thank you.
Is it working? Yeah. Okay, can I stand up? I'm not really good at being seated. That's why I became a teacher, I guess. Bonjour à tous, mon nom est Diane Laure. I'm a faculty member at Ivy Business School. I'm an ethnographer by training. I did my PhD during the financial crisis in 2008 to spend 3 years with the trading floor with traders. And so I come from accounting and finance. So I was not supposed to be here, I guess, you know. So I'm leading a lab, which is the Sustainable Finance Lab at Ivy. I have on the average 10 people in my lab, you know, of course, as students, you know, so students change. Sometimes they stay, sometimes they move. But I will say on average, I have 10 people from undergraduate to postgraduate students and postdocs. Soon a postdoc offer will come, so be if you're interested in joining. So what we do, we are a living lab. So what is a living lab? Basically, we try things. So we work with partners and we try new type of financial products, new type of accounting devices. And then some do work and some don't work, but we're still learning. So this is how we do that. And the way we decided to work, and I decided to work, was on nature-based solutions, so the financing of green infrastructure, which includes biodiversity conservation, but also regenerative agriculture. So we're working also on this topic with more mainstream banks. And also we work a lot on economic reconciliation, okay? Because you cannot work on nature-based solution and the land-based product if you don't work with Indigenous people. So this is what we do. We're mostly qualitative researchers, and we do mostly field work, long-term field work with observation, questionnaires, interviews. This is what we do. Usually it takes a lot of years. We're quite slow. We're slow researchers, okay? I want to say that I'm really excited to be here because Smart Prosperity was the first one to fund my crazy project. And you were the only ones who really believe in it. And so you were the seed funding. And since then, we got more funding and it became quite good, you know, but you need some believers at the beginning to trust you when it hasn't been done. So thanks so much. And I saw some of my students in the picture. So you have some real time and real impact. So thanks. Okay, so I'm going to speak about one project with the conservation impact bonds. And this is a project that's quite unique because we call that 2I project, okay? So 2I it's something that is quite developed in Canada, which is the waiving of Indigenous and Western knowledge. Okay, and this waiving of knowledges is to achieve the best outcomes on land. The best outcome for everyone is to get a healthier and better planet for everyone. It was developed in Nova Scotia. It was developed by an elder, and you have more things on the board here. But to be frank, it hasn't been used very much, okay? And it hasn't been used. I come from a business school, okay? I'm designing financial products. So trying to get a 2i seeing lens in the design of a financial product, it's something else, okay? So this is what I'm gonna speak about, is this project where we design a conservation impact bond, where a 2i seeing lens with governance structures, financial product, evaluation tools that was waiving these two forms of knowledge. Where we did that is in southwestern Ontario, where I come from, in London. So I'm French originally. I moved to the region 10 years ago with my kids. And I was there, and Ivy asked me to come for sustainable finance, bring them. At the beginning, they were like, are you going to do mutual funds or pension funds, like the usual suspects of what you will expect me to do. And I was like, taking a bit of time, and the story was that in my class, my MBA class, what they have to do is to design a new type of financial product that will help solve issues. And then one of my students came to me, Daniel Fuentes, and he said, and I was teaching about this social impact bonds. I have a session on this, and I was telling bad things about that. I was like, it's a financialization of public spaces. You basically privatize what is supposed to be public funding. Not good, And so, but he came to me and he said, do you think we could use this for conservation purposes? Because I'm working with this organization they do like consulting project at the business school, And so they were doing this consulting project with this coalition of conservation organizations. Name is Carolinian Canada Coalition, which is one of the oldest coalition in North America. And they were trying to find funding because actually nobody wants to fund conservation and biodiversity. Especially in this region, because this region is not like up north, is like built. A lot of this GTA, there's real estate, there's farming. So you have all the incentives, but protecting corridor and ecosystems corridors. So they came to me and they said, do you think it could work? And I was like, in front of me, I was like, no, it's not going to work. But I said, as an educator, I was like, yeah, go for it, It's the opportunity cost are low, you're still young, do it, So, but I decided to help him, over time. And then eventually I ended up joining the project. And so this is what we did, and it looks a bit complicated. And I don't expect you to understand everything there. But basically, here's the principle. So you do have investors, and they're going to pay for restoration work. So the investors, I don't know if I have anything here. It's okay. The investors are Verge Capital here, which is a social impact funds in London, Ontario. They're going to put the money, and they're going to say, okay, we're going to pay for this restoration work, okay? Then the Carolinian Canada Coalition will take the money, and they're going to be the facilitator. And they're going to give money to Habitat Partners to do the work. Among these Habitat Partners, there are some nations. So in southwestern Ontario, we have 11 First Nations. Most of them are like Ojibwe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape. And they're all there, and they're the steward of the land. So then they receive some money. There are going to be other organizations receiving some monies. They do the work, restoration, they know their job, And then if they're successful, then what we call outcome payers are going to pay the investors back, plus the interest, okay? And we may think, why are we doing this? Like, why are we just having a grant? It seems complicated to do that. And here are a few reasons. First, there's no grant to start with, okay? The second reason is that it brings more capital, it's private investors. But the third reason is that this structure became a way of coordinating between the different people on the land. So us as a research team, we work also with conservation biologists. We had the Carolinian Coalition that were working with landowners. Everything is privately owned almost in southwestern Ontario. Work with the nation. So it becomes a means of coordination to work together to make decisions for stewarding the land. what we are right now, that was the first one, was Dishkan, ZB Conservation Impact Bond. What was really important is that the image you saw, everything was to icing. So any decision that was made into the bond, where the money goes, where success is being impacted, which investors are going to select, which partners are going to select, which outcome payers are going to be part of the table, was made through a 2ICing lens. Part of the process as well is that everyone has to commit to what we call decolonization workshops. Everyone had to go and visit the lands. So when we had investors from Toronto, they had to come with us and go to the forest and put some boots on and learn about seeds and listen to the Indigenous communities there. So it's a lot of relational work than more transactional. We had the second CIB, so Conservation Impact Bond, which was at Long Point, which is appellate number 2. And now we are zone-wide Conservation Impact Bond, which is the third. We want to do all Southwestern Ontario for a few $1,000,000. So if some wealthy people are in the room, feel free. And so what did we learn from it? That's what the fieldwork looks like, I guess. So we published a few papers. So this is one paper we published, which was about the process of relationship building. And you see it's somehow, this is what 2ICing looks like. It looks a bit like the wampum treaties, you know, when you have these two canoes and the settlers and the Indigenous communities there. And it looked a bit like this, but mostly what it tells is like it's a processual relationship, and you had to go back and forth between the Western and Indigenous forms of knowledge. And what really mattered was this question of ethical space in between. How do we sustain this ethical space? How people commit to this space? Included as researchers, how do we do that? So that's one thing we published, and I'm happy it's online. It's for free, so you can get it. So that's the first thing we published on this. So it's called a 2IC relationship model, a type of governance structures. And the other thing we're working on right now, it's a working paper. It's a bit what you work on. It's from the research methods perspective. So what we realize is that the type of work you do with One Nation is a bit different from the type of work we do, because we're on a territory when we have 11 First Nations with different cultures, different governance mechanisms. So it's not like one nation could just come and decide, and you have these protocols. So we identify a different form of 2ICing. So I guess your research will be more like the nation-based 2ICing. That will be you work with one nation. You can have the team-based when you have Indigenous researchers and Western researchers, and they're going to work together. And then you have our approach, which is territory-based, which is much more different because, for instance, my university, Western University, has relationship with the nations. They have treaties in place. They have land agreements. So when I go to the nation, I'm carrying these relationships as well. So it's a different way of relating to the Indigenous communities. And the last one is something we see more rarely, but will be like, for instance, if you want to work with urban Indigenous peoples. So it's like a collective with different type of governance structure. So we work on this paper and we say, okay, how do you want to work as a researcher? We have a bit of reflection as well on this. And mostly it's, who are the researchers? This is already a big question because while we're researchers, it's a very Western lens. We just have some knowledge. The modalities through which the land is included in the research is really important. The representation of the Indigenous eyes, how Indigenous peoples are evoked their knowledge there. And really what matters is a co-creation of the ethical space. I guess this is what I wanted to say in a brief conversation. I'm happy to take questions, and I'm happy to share the papers as well. Thank you.
So our next speaker, Dr. Cliff Atleo. It's good to see you, Cliff. We have your slides up. I'm not sure if you can see them.
Yeah. The slides are more FYI. Sarah did provide them for me, and I'm not going to be using them.
Great.
Some of the professors in the room might relate to this idea when your PhD student becomes more of an expert than you are in what they're doing. So I've sort of adapted a, so I'm not going to be using any slides.
Okay.
But
you can take the slides down then and just
yeah.
leave up. Okay, take it away, Cliff. Thanks.
Oh, and if you could remind me how much time should I? About 15 minutes, 10 minutes?
10 to 15. It's
okay.
flexible.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my name is Cliff Atleo. I see that Sarah put in Cliff Atleo Jr. there. My dad is Cliff Atleo Sr., or Wiccaninish is his new channel name. And he's 81. He's still super active in fisheries issues and residential school issues and Indigenous community health. So depending on where I am, I have to throw in the junior to distinguish myself from my dad. And he's even co-authoring academic articles. So Google Scholar sent me a notification saying, "Did you author this?" And I had to say no. That was my dad who was working with colleagues on a fisheries paper. But so yeah, I just should introduce myself a little bit more. I'm Nuu-chah-nulth on my father's side from the community of Ahousaht, which is on the west coast of Vancouver Island, British Columbia. And I carry the name Cha-chim-mah-nee from the house of Glockish there in Ahousaht. And on my mother's side, I am Tsimshian, so more up in the middle of BC, in Tsimshian territory, close to Terrace, BC. And we're from a community called Kitsilas and the house Nis Haiwas. And I have two names from this house. Samoyegit Nis Naya, which is a title and a name, sort of a sub-chief in that house. And Gamayam is the other name that I hold in that house. I am also an associate professor in the School of Resource and Environmental Management here at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, BC. And for this year, I am the graduate program chair. So Sarah Ozog is one of my PhD candidates. I currently have 5 students, 4 master's students and Sarah. And I was just looking at my CV recently, and I've graduated 11 students since I've been here since 2016. All master's students, and of the 11 students, 2 of them have been Indigenous and 9 of them have been non-Indigenous. I teach Indigenous governance. My background is in political science, and I'm interested in Indigenous communities from a political economy perspective, self-determination, and how, like many of the stories we see in the news about impact benefit agreements regarding a pipeline or opposition from communities for a pipeline, or forestry, such as in the Fairy Creek disputes going back a few years on Vancouver Island, or even going back 30 years in my dad's home territory of Clayoquot Sound, what they had called the War in the Woods. So I'm interested in all of these particular interfaces that we see in the news, and that's mostly what I teach and research. I have a few funded research grants right now through SSHRC, the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, of course, this SPI grant that Sarah's been working on in her work with Haida nations of Skidegate and Old Masset. And I also have, I'm just wrapping up a research grant with the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, so a CIHR grant that was looking at Indigenous community responses to COVID-19, just looking at specific differences, I guess, in how policies were implemented, how Indigenous communities were trying to assert both territorial sovereignty and data sovereignty, and improving their communications with health agencies. And yeah, just really trying to understand that impact. As some people have alluded to, of course, we're right now in some pretty tumultuous times. Every day it looks a little bit different in different parts of the day, with the election south of the border. I've taken a particular interest in how this impacts Indigenous communities, specifically here, as it relates to resources and resource extraction. So David Eby, our premier, had mentioned the need to fast track impact assessments or environmental assessments. And of course, that is going to change, that is going to have an effect on Indigenous communities, especially with this long history of exploitation and resource extraction on their lands. But today I do want to focus a little bit more on what we're talking about with respect to research with Indigenous communities. So the project that Sarah has been working on this Smart Prosperity Institute grant is called Reconciliation and Decarbonation Policy Integration, Examining Opportunities for UNDRIP Implementation in the Haida Energy Transition. So Haida Gwaii has also been in the news recently for a number of different positive reasons, I believe. They were recently title to their archipelago, to all of their islands, was granted. And then last year there was also sort of enabling legislation toward that effect. People are still trying to figure out exactly what that means, but it is a big move, especially in a place like British Columbia, where the Crown land is quite substantial. I don't remember the exact percentage, but I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% of the land in BC is considered Crown land. So the fact that a First Nation, through negotiation, which I think is almost unprecedented now, is getting access or control, if you will, jurisdictional recognition to all of their territory, minus the private lands in Haida Gwaii, is quite significant. There have been court cases, of course, like Tsilhqot'in, who won their title case in 2014, and to a lesser extent, the Nuchatlet case more recently on Vancouver Island, where they were granted partial recognition of their territory. A lot of this has really changed the landscape of how we understand resource extraction and respect for Indigenous jurisdiction in their territory. So Sarah's project is really looking, she's been working with the Haida on and off for quite some time, going back to her master's degree, which she completed, I think, about 15 years ago now, through UNBC. She had worked with Haida as well as Tsuk First Nations on their energy transition, and she's actively working with Haida Nations, specifically right now working on a solar project and getting their solar project online. So Sarah's occupying that space that often scholars will do, in sort of working for the nation, and doing her PhD at the same time. So the last part I want to mention about the specific research that Sarah has also been involved in is a Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions grant, which we received a few years ago now, but this was to look at the exploration of marine decarbonization, specifically the feasibility of Indigenous owned marine vessels. So for communities like Skidegate and Masset in Haida Gwaii, as well as communities in my Nuu-Chonolth communities and their neighboring nations, the Nuu-Chonolth nations, we've been looking at their marine fleets, both fishing fleets as well as government boats, monitoring boats. There is a few communities that have recreational businesses like whale watching businesses, and so we're looking at what they use their boats for, what kind of fuels they use, getting a sense of their needs and requirements, because they're all, some boats are river boats, some boats are ocean going, and they do many different things. We're working with a group of engineers at University of Victoria to do the math, because I'm terrible at math, and the goal of that particular project is to give the nations as much information as they have about their options. So the thing about decarbonizing the marine space right now is it's still very, very early days, and 100% electric vessels may not be practical in all scenarios. It's emerging that more likely some sort of hybrid vessel where you have diesel and electric motors. If you can imagine the way we thought of Priuses, 10, 15 years ago, added range and efficiency, and reducing cost. That is going to be fairly likely. Hydrogen is also a possibility. So our goal with this is just to get a sense of what nations need, based on their current usage, and what the potential options might be. So it really is a spectrum of possibilities. But none of these options necessarily are in wide scale production. So it's all also still very expensive right now. If you were to consider building an electric vessel or even a hybrid vessel, you would have to retrofit. So that's the other project that Sarah is leading in Haida Gwaii, in addition to her other work around, their energy and getting off diesel. Also, as part of my PICS project is looking at the marine side of that particular equation. Okay, so I'm going to get to an emphasis on working with Indigenous peoples. So this comes up in my training of graduate students, as well as my teaching in the classrooms, and also drawing on my own experiences working with Indigenous communities, because I have worked with my own communities, and that's building on relationships that have come over decades. But I also work with other Indigenous communities where I'm also a visitor. I have a student working with the Stalo First Nation. I've I have Sarah working with the Haida First Nations of Skidegate and Old Masset as well. So in many ways, I'm a visitor as much as anyone is in those territories when I'm supporting students doing their work. So one of the first things that I try to emphasize with people is to understand that nations are diverse, and to focus on local needs and priorities. Two-eyed seeing, for example, has come up a lot in, we've heard in the previous presentation. I am working with a student who is working with Snuneymuxw First Nation, which is a southern neighbor to my communities. And they had an interesting sort of approach based there in which they called it paddling on both sides of the canoe. And so you get a bit of a sense of this kind of metaphor, but it's a bit more of a localized methodology in terms of working in this transdisciplinary way of co-crafting research priorities with a community. So I'm old enough in the sense that I sort of appreciate and understand the contemporary research environment, but I'm also old enough in that I remember what it was like before. And this is where you will hear references to people feeling research fatigue or exhaustion. I think Barbara Wilson, one of the Haida elders that Sarah's worked with, she described it as being feeling like a rare species or something that people would come to and study. And there was very much an extractive element to those previous relationships. Whereas today, like I said, a lot of people are working both Indigenous and non-Indigenous to center Indigenous research priorities. Sometimes, as my fellow presenters have mentioned, this happens over a great period of time. Another scholar that I was talking to recently, he made an interesting example of his work. He works in the north, and he's at Memorial University, I believe, in Newfoundland. And he was working with Inuit communities in the north, and in a very typical way, he was going up there, for a week at a time or a few days at a time, and then flying out. And he was sensitive enough to know that this was kind of rubbing his research collaborators the wrong way. They're like, oh, like you're one of those folks. So his solution was interesting, and I don't think it's accessible to everybody, but he said the next time he went up, he booked a one-way ticket. And he's basically said, I'm just going to be here as long as I can, or as long as I need to be, and kind of leave it at that. And so, like I said, I know that that's not open for everybody, especially students. We all have sort of, working within grants with funding constraints, but I appreciated the sentiment that he was going to take as long as it took to work with his research collaborators in the north. So that leads to this idea of being patient. I'm also going to cite Kendrick Lamar here. Be humble, I think, is definitely, and that's something that came up in Michaela's presentation as well, is approaching Indigenous communities, more as partners and not necessarily as an expert per se, but engaging in this dialogue, engaging in these approaches that are mutually beneficial. One of the other things I've learned as well. So on the one hand, I've often taught students that they have to be patient, that relationships takes time. Sometimes these students are establishing these relationships on their own. Sometimes they're utilizing the networks of existing faculty or existing projects. And so it can be a little bit easier in that regard. But also, I've had an experience working with the Squamish Nation, for example, where we had a meeting with them. They came on as a research partner as part of a larger, a different PICS project. And it was quite brief in many ways. They were saying, okay, I have this, and this on my plate. I have these two things that we would like to do that we can't do, and we would just need help with that. And it was very minimalist, if you will, like it was a very light touch. And so that also sort of indicates a certain amount of research fatigue. and it gives you a sense that some communities have very different capacities in which to manage things, and sometimes they do need help, but it's like I said, a very a light touch sort of research approach where they give you very specific parameters. We could use some help on this, on gathering this kind of data or doing this kind of literature review, and it's just it is more brief, but it's not extractive because they're being very clear about what their priorities are and appreciating your research support, but still leading the overall direction. I do want to draw your attention to OCAP principles. You guys can Google that if you don't already know about it, but these are principles of ownership, control, access, and possession. And this again goes to centering research within Indigenous communities, leaving data with them. So all of the projects that I do, for example, all of the data gets sent back to them. They have it and can do what they wish. And again, some of you who've worked in this field know in the past we would often destroy data, or there's a certain period of time, number of years where data gets destroyed, which is something I never fully understood. But in all of the projects that we work with right now with Indigenous communities, we just give it back to them and say, here, this is yours, do with as you wish. And often this is after sort of a research protocol is established where you get agreement beforehand about what the outputs are. So, you have a student's thesis or dissertation, you may have some presentations, you may have some publications. And again, those things can also take varying degrees of involvement with First Nations partners. In some cases, I've had situations where community people are interested in co-authoring, so they become more involved in that process of the knowledge dissemination. And in other cases, they just literally don't have the time, but they do have oversight and sort of have a final say about how they're being represented in those publications. So again, it's sort of a mixture of involvement from communities based on their time and capacity. The other thing that I think I often try to impart upon students is that working with Indigenous communities almost always involves more work. And to give you a sense, I've had people work on projects where they had community-facing outputs. So they had, I had a student working with the Metlakatla Cumulative Effects Management Program, for example, and they had this full-blown, community-facing, written for the layperson report. And this is, 40, 50 pages or what have you, but it didn't sort of meet our academic rigor requirements. And so they had to adapt that quite heavily, full of citations and methodology and more description about, sort of more critical analysis, if you will, for their thesis project. So in some ways, the students were not really writing double or doing double the work, but certainly substantially more. Some of the stuff that Sarah has identified specifically, and you'll see this information in her slides, because like I said, she's provided them to you, is a reference to Verna Kirkness and Ray Barnhart's 4Rs approach, and it reminds me a little bit of Michaela's L's approach, and this is referencing respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. And Sarah also draws on Sean Wilson and the Smiths. I call them the Smiths, Linda Tuhiwe Smith and Graham Smith, who are two Maori scholars who've done a lot of work in this realm as well, and articulated the importance of approaching research with Indigenous communities in respectful ways. I think that's about it. So yeah, thank you for your time, and I'm open to any other discussions with panelists or questions from the audience, and I hand it back to you.
Thanks, Cliff. Nicola, do you want to come join us on stage? You're welcome to use the podium or grab a seat, however you would like. Yeah, the previous policy discussant is unable to join us today, so you're up first.
I'm up first. Okay.
Sorry to surprise you.
No problem. That sounds great. Hello, everyone. My name is Nicolas Drouin. I work with Environment and Climate Change Canada with the Canadian Wildlife Service. And I am in a team that is working on biodiversity policy and programming. And so our team is responsible for negotiations with the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CITES Convention on Endangered Species. We're also involved in the implementation of our commitment that we did in Montreal with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And so I'm involved on both of these issues, and we're working as a team very collaboratively with Indigenous people. So I'm very happy to be here today. I think it's a great opportunity. We rarely have a chance to slow down and hear about research. Our environment is very fast-paced. We are responding to urgent requests and producing documents and policies. And I think this is a great opportunity. I haven't been in school in quite a while. I studied political science and economics at Laval University about 30 years ago. And I'm happily back in school with Cambridge taking a sustainable finance course right now. So back in this world, and happy to be here today at Ottawa U as well. And I'd like to thank the Smart Prosperity Institute, as well as Michaela, Diane, and Cliff for their great presentations. I found them very informative, and it's a unique opportunity to learn about the different projects, the different research that you've been involved with. And as I said, we don't really have a chance to go ourselves in the communities and take the time that it takes to understand what's happening. And so your insights and the time that you take to do that research and how you go about doing the research is very helpful for us and provides us with insights into the relevance of the different policies and programs that we put into practice and recommend to the government. So I would like to thank you and encourage all of you to continue to do this great research, and hopefully this research makes it to us policymakers. And admittedly, as I prepared for that event, which I was invited a few days ago, I wasn't aware of the different research projects that that were presented today, including the one presented by Diane, the very interesting impact bond project, which, interestingly enough, my responsibility includes being the lead for the federal government on developing innovative nature finance instruments. And so that's my responsibility. And so part of my work is to analyze the types of innovative finance instruments and try to understand what works, what doesn't work. And I didn't know about your project. So I'm very happy to learn about it. And I was able to contact some people who knew about this initiative before coming here. And I look forward to learning more and pursuing discussions. And so I think this is great. And so for this project and the two other ones that have been discussed, as well as the other initiatives that SPI and US students are involved with, I think that the work that you're doing is very important to us policymakers. And I would say maybe I was asked to talk to how to make research relevant to policymaking. I think this is a very interesting question, but also at the same time, not all research needs to be oriented towards policymaking either. So just want to put that as a caveat. But sitting from where I'm at as a manager in a policy shop, then the type of research that you're undertaking, I view that from a specific lens, and understanding the Indigenous perspective and how to go about doing Indigenous programming, Indigenous research is very valuable because we want to avoid some pitfalls. We want to avoid doing things the wrong way. And so, for example, we know that as we elaborated our Canada 2030 nature strategy, which I encourage you to read if you haven't done so yet, we have done a long process of consultation. We had a series of discussions with various Indigenous peoples, organizations and communities and in Canada as we prepared that initiative. And so we've consulted them and we shared our drafts with them. So this is, we have continuous tables of discussion with Indigenous peoples as we implement the nature strategy. I'm not personally leading on these. I'm the nature finance person, but I have colleagues working on them. And so you may know, for example, that we recently agreed a new partnership for permanence initiative with the Northwest Territory, a very large conservation project, and we're very pleased to do that. And so in that context, we understand that the role of Indigenous peoples is very central to how we implement our nature strategy. And similarly, when we went to COP16 in Cali last fall, we worked very closely, our delegation, with Indigenous groups in reaching an agreement on a permanent Indigenous body within the Convention on Biological Diversity to ensure that the voice of Indigenous peoples be acknowledged, be heard, and be taken into account in every decision that the Convention is taking. So we're very proud of that achievement. That's one of our key achievements that we've done in Cali. So going back to research, so from my perspective, when I look at when I have the ability or the opportunity, the time to look at this type of research, there's a few questions that I'm interested in, and these may be relevant to you. And if you're doing research with a view of trying to influence policy, maybe I can share a few words about what kind of questions I'm asking myself. So when I look at these projects, for example, the Impact Bond Initiative, then some of the questions that I have is, well, what kind of results have been achieved to date, obviously? Who were the people involved? Were the Indigenous groups that were involved, were they involved from the outset? Are they satisfied with the process of the development of the project, of the implementation of the project? How is it impacting communities, obviously? So that's very important to us. But also, when it comes to thinking about it from a policy angle, then the questions that I will be asking myself is it cost efficient? Is it replicable? Can it be scaled up? Or is it very specific to that nation? Can it be transferred to another example? Are there, is it the most, is it an intervention that I would recommend to be replicated, to be scaled up to other regions? And if so, then maybe we can't have a cookie cutter approach, and it needs to be adapted. And if we want to adapt it to other regions and to other Indigenous peoples groups, what are the key factors that we need to take into account as we design these initiatives? So when it comes, for example, to the Impact Bond, I've had the opportunity to work on the first pilot that the Government of Canada funded with a private equity firm in impact investing. And we were looking at whether our initiative was catalytic in pooling funds from the private sector and non-traditional investors. So for example, when I look at this, then one of the questions that I have for this specific project that I'm asking myself is the impact investor, was the impact investor taking a significant risk in doing that initiative? How has the project been designed to reduce this risk? Has the risk materialized or not? Have we shared the information about the nature of this project to other potential impact investors or more traditional investors to demonstrate that, in fact, the risk is higher than it is perceived? How catalytic has the Government of Canada contribution to that project been? What is our leveraging effect? For example, that's specific to the investment world, but these are some of the questions that I would be asking myself. And so other questions that I would have is, does this research help me to understand how can we best, how can the government of Canada best facilitate the role of the private sector, of NGOs, the role of Indigenous peoples in doing other conservation projects? What has worked, what hasn't worked? How can we learn from that initiative in trying to improve the policies, the regulations, the market signals that we would need to develop in order to facilitate nature finance, for example? And the same could be true for climate change, for helping the transition of communities from fossil fuels to renewable energies in remote communities. And so these are some of the questions that one would have, and especially I would say in the current fiscal and political context, where, as you may understand, the budgets are fairly strained, and so we will be put to task in demonstrating if we are to recommend new funding or they're bringing forward and renewing some of the current funding envelopes, then we would need to ask these questions about cost efficiency and relevance and replicability and scalability and so on and so forth. So I would say these are some of the key issues that we're asking. And if researchers like you can help us to identify these, and what are the best practices, what are these lessons learned, then maybe that would help us to orient our recommendations to our senior management. And eventually, these type of initiatives may find themselves being adopted, replicated, funded, depending on the relevance of the research and what it's been able to demonstrate. And I would say it's also linked to some of the reflections that we need to have, I think, with the, some people have made reference to our lovely neighbors from the south, but there's a growing anti-environment, social governance, investment headwinds that we are facing with, different institutional investors moving away from making declarations for net zero and so on and so forth. So we need to reflect carefully, how do we position ourselves, like how in terms of our own investments, our recommendations to government in the context of a trade war, of an impact on the Canadian economy, on workers, on communities. And so it may be that some well-oriented research can help us to shed light into some of these and be part of the solution. So I would like to encourage you to pursue that kind of research, and if it's policy relevant, then all the better. And just make sure you communicate it to us. You keep organizing these wonderful events, and then we'll be showing up and listening to you, and hopefully put that into practice. Thank you. I hope that's useful.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent set of presentations. Thank you, all three of you. And now let's move into Q&A session. I want to start with a question from the floor. You can use a microphone or not. It's up to you, but there is one here. Any questions from the floor?
Okay, so as you said, this is actually took me to the group at Bank of Canada. They want to link monetary policy with Indigenous nations. So I raised a question, which is whether financial institutions really care about Indigenous nations or not. So they said, yes, they do care, but there is no proof, I would say. So then I raised the question actually to talk about monetary policy. So we're going to see eventually how monetary policy beneficial for Indigenous nations. And we also have another research idea about natural finance too. So we're going to talk about it later. Now, the question for you, Professor, you mentioned that you have you run a lab, right, at the university. So I just want to see, I want to hear from you if there is any quant research you do or any sort of like financial data you have or you work on it. Thank you so much. This is the first
Yeah, thank you so much. So the question is whether we have quantitative data working on finance and the difficulty of accessing data and running quantitative analysis when we work with Indigenous nations. I think that data access is something complicated in any case, whether it's qualitative or quantitative data. Like, for instance, for us, for the Eldervin First Nations, they don't feel census data. They don't want the federal government to have access to their data. So we don't even have data for how many people live in the reserve and those type of economic data as well. So the way we've been working on, and we're working on the economic reconciliation and capital markets as well. So my short answer is that we don't have more data than you do. We haven't found any magic data somewhere hidden. But what we do, though, is that we work with Indigenous partners. And so in Canada, you have the Responsible Investment Reconciliation Initiative, which is with the Responsible Investment Association, where there's some asset owners and asset managers, and they work with NATOA, which is also Indigenous leaders, and they do have access and they do have experience as well in this field. You also have FNMPC, the First Nation Major Coalition Project. They do have access as well to their own data, but they will be really careful to share this data. So I think this is also the trust you will have to put in place to get this data. We published a report, it's called Indigenous Peoples and Responsible Investment in Canada. One of the questions we asked, we heard that Indigenous settlements were one of the fastest growing asset classes in Canada because they receive millions into settlements. We also look at equity deals with critical minerals, hydro. There's a lot of deals that are being negotiated right now. So we wanted to know, okay, how is money invested? What do they do? We couldn't even get the numbers. We have to guess and get some, guessing. And now when we work with our nations, because they trust us, they will tell us which numbers, which are the issues they have. So I think a key knowledge as well is the way nations work is a bit different from how capital markets work. Capital markets are really they really look at the relationship between the corporations and the asset managers. They're going to get shared engagement, ESG data. The nations, they're much more interested in their nations, in infrastructure projects, in how this money is being managed, And so this is less of public data, but is also less of interest to usually how finance has been conducted. The last thing also we've done, we have somehow now a research project. We've been contacted by nations because they were looking for accounting and financial skills to run the deals, because they do have, you have Indigenous lawyers now, but you don't have many Indigenous CPAs. You don't have a lot of people in financial skills. So what we're doing, and they came to us as the business school, I said, could you help, But what we see as well is that accounting and financial profession is really not open to Indigenous peoples. They don't want to come to the business school. We are the least attractive on campus. They hate us, and rightfully so, because we're probably the epitome of colonization, capitalism. So there's also this question too, is how do you equip Indigenous nations on those skills in a way that empower them instead of subjugating them again, because this is how accounting and finance has been used traditionally. It's been used to extract from them, to subjugate them. And so there's also this relationship building to be worked upon. So I guess it's a multiple complex, and I'm glad you're working on this.
All right, we have a question from online, and we have nearly 50 people online. So please send us more of your questions. The first one is for you, Michaela. I'm just going to read it to you. I really appreciated your presentation and the L principles you propose. It was excellent. Toward the end of the presentation, you mentioned that the project became more process-oriented rather than outcome-oriented. Can you speak more about this and why process-oriented was deemed better, especially in the context of working with Indigenous peoples whom the government often engages, but who don't always end up benefiting in the way that we hope?
Yes, thank you for the question. A really important one, I think. The process focus for this work came out of a few different places. I think The reason it was first important was due to the transdisciplinary approach, meaning that from the beginning, we were kind of figuring things out together. And as I mentioned, we had a starting point. We had a framework that standard versions of this framework, when they ask for kind of community input and community knowledge, they tend to ask for that at particular points in the process and kind of in response to these predetermined questions. So we had to I didn't have the knowledge, of course, to decide on my own, what does it look like if we take away that prescriptiveness? So I guess that process orientation really started from the approach that we were taking, which was a very collective approach. We did have outcomes that were important, and I don't want to kind of act like what comes out of a process of climate change adaptation planning isn't important. We did develop a very robust, very long and detailed and data-filled community climate adaptation plan, which kind of really covers everything that we did in that process. But even the plan itself is a walk through that process. And the importance of having people involved from the very beginning not only was so that they could determine what that process looked like, but was so that they do it on their own, because often in the literature we talk about how adaptation planning, the frameworks look linear but cyclical. They come back to step one, and we do talk about that. This isn't something that you just do one time and forget. You can't just adapt to climate change and then you're done. So that kind of process focus is a little bit built in. I think what we ended up with was, rather than just a community adaptation plan that was customized to this local place, we ended up with a adaptation planning process that was locally customized to place. And that does make it difficult to say that this is generalizable, but it is transferable, I think, and in kind of our more scholarly focused outputs, we're trying to focus on what are the takeaways, what are the key pieces of this, or the bones or the skeletons of this that can be transplanted so that other communities can design their own process rather than just design their own plan. Hopefully that clarifies things a little bit. Thanks for the question.
Hi, my name is Justin, master's student in the Environmental Sustainability program at U Ottawa. I guess this question is for all of you, as well as the professor who presented from online. Do you think it's possible to develop an effective framework in Canada for two-eyed seeing within the sort of immediate time scale that seems to be, ever approaching for climate adaptation and creating those sort of necessary, very rapid responses where clearly it's going to take some time to continue to deepen these relationships and create more effective research frameworks and methods. So I guess, my question would be, how can those two time scales be reconciled, and is that possible?
To ask the colleague online, maybe? Can you? I'm just offering the space. It's okay, I'm gonna go then. But if the colleague online wants to step in, please. I think it's a great question. So, sustainable development is always, we talk about the future, but mostly the question is how you manage the short-term needs and get the long-term sustainability. That's the key thing, because that's the conflictual relationship. So I guess the question is, when it comes to nature-based solution, any win is a win. So this is how I take the spirit in the lab. So some mornings I'm like, what am I doing this? It's just like so small, and we're never gonna get this on time. And it's quite a bit, and we know eco-anxiety, there's been some good research on this, by the way, on climate scientists. And we know that 50% of researchers quit science after 1 decade, especially in climate science and conservation biology, because they see things that are not good. They don't go as fast as they could. So my own way of dealing with this anxiety, I guess, is to try to be as practical as I can. Like we had the real-time effect on our territory. We work together and we go forward day after day. And somehow we build a path toward reconciliation and we engage into this journey. Do we make mistakes? Yes. Is it perfect? No. But at least we have engaged and we have restored some ecosystems. We have the bond as enabled to land Indigenous land guardians programs. So we are also training the youth. They come to my classes. We train people. So I try to get this micro thing and try to get hope from this. Am I optimistic in the course of the words? I mean, the numbers are telling, truth telling. Like we're not on the path toward even 1.5, even 2 degrees scenario. And I'm even more worried now that the financing is going more to what we call like different type of assets, I will say, and investments. Yeah, but you need to do your part, I guess. This is, especially as you start your career, try to find your energy into people that surround you and try to do things where you can. And this is already, again, for these people and for your community. And if everybody does that, that'll be good, you know? That's my way. It's not a perfect way.
I love that answer. I think I'm going to say something pretty similar. As a geographer, I think of things in terms of scale, and I feel like there's such a scale problem that's always happening with climate change and the climate crisis, and it feels so big. It's something that does happen at a global scale, but where we feel it and where we experience it is inevitably local. And so I think my answer is the same, finding ways to, the way that I lean into not getting overwhelmed by the scale of it and the insurmountableness is to scale down and look at what can we do. And I think it's reasonable to feel like I can't reverse the climate crisis myself, but it's also reasonable to say I can make something happen in my own community. I can mobilize people. I can get people on board. And I think we know the threat is immediate or very urgent, but it's always been that way. And I also think it's already something that's happening. And we know that, but I think often we tend to think of it as something's about to happen, something's about to happen. And if we can kind of just say, okay, well, what's happening right now and what can we do right now in this moment, but also in this place, wherever that place is, that's how I cope with that.
Just add a few words. I would agree with both Diana and Michaela. I think these are very wise words. I would probably just add, building on the two previous answers, that I think we need both a multi-pronged and a multi-speed approach, both from a research perspective as well as from sort of a policy and programming perspective. So some actions, some research, some policies need to be enacted and done fairly quickly. And yes, there will be mistakes, and yes, some risk will have to be taken. But also going back to your question on the two-eyed approach, recognizing that engagement, meaningful engagement, co-design, co-ownership takes time, and you need to build that trust, you need to build that relationship, and you need to make it to ensure that the appropriate time and trust building is done, to do it appropriately. And it doesn't mean that one has to choose between one and the other. I think both can happen at the same time. And one needs to address the immediacy of some of the urgent issues that are right in front of us, while at the same time not losing sight of the long term and the importance of building that trust, that relationship, and that meaningful engagement through having these thorough research approaches.
All right. Well, I like that, a message of hope. I think we're trying to bring Cliff up.
Yeah, I've got my little hand up there.
Hi, Cliff. Good to see you again.
Yeah, what this really reminds me of is Kyle White. He's a Ojibwe scholar. I believe he's at Michigan or Michigan State. And he's got a 2019 article titled Too Late for Indigenous Climate Justice, Ecological and Relational Tipping Points. And while it sounds pretty depressing, a lot of climate work can feel that way. He brings in, I think he introduces, it's a short piece, it's only like 7 pages, but he introduces this idea of a relational tipping point. And this would, be more of the long-term sort of approach, and how he discusses the importance of trust, and that trust needs to be rebuilt. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a lot of time. While at the same time, we recognize in the real world that we have immediate fires to put out right now. So it's not like I said, it's not like a practical best practices type of read, but I think it's really an important one to think about how we would hold on to immediate short-term priorities and long-term issues that need to, he's arguing that if they're not addressed, then you'll always be putting out short-term fires without this sort of long-term relational planning. And one of the things that he writes about is Indigenous peoples living, I think he says, living our ancestors' apocalypse. And so he was trying to describe, a lot of this climate anxiety, a lot of, these studies that we've seen that have come out, and people feeling, even youth feeling quite anxious about the state of the world. He's kind of suggesting that Indigenous peoples have been living this for a while. If you think of the transformation of their homelands and their territories and their loss of traditional livelihoods and loss of species, the reality is many communities have been living through these apocalyptic type of scenarios, and he's trying to suggest why that might describe why they're not, freaking out, I guess. I don't know if that's too a blunt way to put it, but it connects me to another concept that I've been working with in some of the research I've been doing, and this idea of home and trying to make sense and understand Indigenous communities' decision-making about economic issues, about resource issues, about planning. And it occurred to me, like I said, it seemed like a really obvious thing, but it wasn't something that was at the top of my mind, was this idea that Indigenous communities have no other sense of home, and it never even enters their mind that they might, have to migrate or go somewhere else. So they really often do think on this really long time scale, thinking generations back, 150 years, and generations forward another 150 years. That a lot of that enters into the decision making, in addition to the, like I said, the practical, what kind of things need to be addressed immediately. So a bit more of a theoretical response, but I think White introduces some really important things to think about.
So the next question is to all the panelists. In your experience working with Indigenous communities, have you encountered challenges related to intellectual property or the use of Indigenous knowledge in your research? If so, how are these challenges addressed, and what lessons have you learned that inform your current practices? Who wants to start?
Thanks for the question. In my one research project that I can draw from, this was dealt with through what ended up being a pretty formal process of establishing a research agreement between us on the university side as the researchers and the Indigenous community. And we actually produced a long document. We all signed it, but we spent time kind of working together on what this should look like, especially from the community's side, what type of their knowledge they were willing to share and what type they were not willing to share, and then our responsibility as researchers to respect and make sure that we determine which type of knowledge and data each thing that we're looking at is, so that when we make something public or publish that is aligned with the community's preferences. And so we did kind of establish this in a research agreement already, but I would just say it for sure is an ongoing conversation. I don't think it's something that you need to never talk about again once you decide. And so certainly every time I am sharing about the research or I'm planning to publish, there's a lot of back and forth and communication between myself and the community on, are you comfortable to share this? Is this something that we want to make public? If so, are there pieces that we would like to redact? And in terms of naming participants, often in university contexts, we kind of assume that like you protect confidentiality or work towards anonymity in all contexts. That's not always necessarily the case. Sometimes when elders are sharing cultural knowledge and they want it to be shared, they'll also want to be named. So those were also conversations that came up later on and that kind of we make on a case-by-case basis. And that might be a conversation that I have directly with the elder who I spoke with, or that I can ask kind of administrative people in administrative roles in the community to help me out with. So I hope that answers the question. I'll pass it on to somebody else.
So it's a good question. And of course, you have to follow OCAP principles, and we already talked about that. In our project, we're creating new things. So it's a new project when we create a new type of financial instrument that was not existing. And we're working with multiple nations. And so the governance structure for the relationship with the nations is not that obvious. It's difficult. And even the Indigenous protocols, which protocols are you following when you do a ceremony, when you do a meeting, when you know they're different nations, we'll have different protocols. And so for us, this is what we call this territory-based UICing. When you work at the scale of a territory, and then the knowledge is at the scale of the territory. So what we've decided to do recently as we're going in scale is to follow a treaty, which is the One Dish, One Spoon Covenant, which is a treaty that is in the Great Lake regions, which is a pre-contact treaty that nations abided by, and also that the settlers signed and did not commit really, but at least signed it. And so our rules for sharing is to follow the spirit of the treaty. And so all decision has to be made in a way that's the one dish, one spoon is that the land, the territory is one dish and we only have one spoon together and we share that for the best. And so I think this has been the rule what we've been following. And so that's the rule we follow as well, somehow for the knowledge sharing. And which type of knowledge we share, how ethically we share it, how we bring elders to the table, how we bring the land guardians, the youth to the table. So that's a bit of how the project works. We have an Indigenous leadership director, Sam White-Eye, was a key person for this Indigenous knowledge sharing. She's managing the relationship with the nations. And so we always work with her in our research. We work really closely with her to be sure we follow our guidance, and we're not going to do anything without our guidance there. And in a very practical term, any research, any working paper, any presentation, even today, I always inform the partners. I always share my papers. I went and presented my papers, always, and so, and I'm not sharing Indigenous knowledge. This is not my duty. This is not my privilege, So even in the papers, if you read them, I share the story. I'm a storyteller of the project, but I will never share Indigenous knowledge because it is something that should be done by Indigenous peoples in a way that is respectful and ethically sounded. So I guess that will be my thing. For OCAP principle, of course, all the data you collect belong to the community when it's collected in the community as well. So that's more classical, I guess.
Maybe just a few words. I do not have much experience implementing projects working directly with Indigenous communities in Canada. I spent most of my career at Foreign Affairs working on international development, and there may be some similarities, but of course differences. But I would say when I worked with vulnerable communities in various countries on the globe, I found how important it was to take the time to actually sit down with the community, to actively listen to them, understand what their needs were, and put into practice not doing something for them without them. And so I would say that this is probably applicable to the question that you've asked, and I'm probably revealing a bit my age here, but I was part of a youth environmental coalition in preparation for a UN summit in 1996, and we had a number of Indigenous peoples as part of the environmental coalition, and we were students, the master's degree, and very gung-ho, knowing about the UN lingo and the negotiations, and very adamant about getting some language into the UN treaty. And then we encountered a bit of a crisis because we as a coalition, mostly with non-Indigenous people, we went straight into the subject without building that trust and that relationship with our Indigenous partners, peers, as part of the coalition. And it created a bit of a commotion, and we had to sort of halt the process and stop talking about the UN and the meeting that was coming, and trying to really step back and understand each other. And then we were able to work effectively together. And so that's some lessons learned that I've experienced, and I hope that's relevant to the question. Thank you. That's all I can offer.
Part of the data gathering involved the community census. So it was a census that the community conducts itself, and they didn't want certain information from there shared with the outside world, so that was redacted. I've also seen in some cases where certain information is shared orally in a defense, for example, but it doesn't come in the written, in the thesis or dissertation. Certain aspects are withheld. And we often just, defer to the First Nation about what information they're willing to share with the outside world and what they would like to keep internally. The second point is similar to Michaela's, and this is attribution. I've always been irked, in just my own weird little way, when I see a paper and it says informant 1, informant 2, informant 3, and it says informant 3 says this, and you go back, informant 7 says this, and it's just a weird social science convention that I've never really appreciated. I do respect anonymity when it comes up, especially around contentious issues, but oftentimes leaders or elders will we get the permission for attribution, and I think they provide a certain voice that is important, especially in publications that are by non-Indigenous people, because if it is, you get this weird feeling like it's more about the writer than it is about sort of sharing these experiences from community leaders. So I'm a big fan of attribution as long as people are okay with it and and they consent to that.
Thanks, Cliff. So at this point, we're going to move into a short break and then into our round tables where we can continue the conversation. So if you have any questions that are burning, there's still time to kind of get into those with your groups. But first, please join me in a round of applause for all of our presenters.